Welcome back and happy Tuesday, March 9th, 2021. James Freeman over at the Wall Street Journal postulated some thoughts I too have been turning over in my head recently. What would the Gippers' reactions be to China today? Ronald Reagan had all the right instincts about the threat of communist China. It seems to me, and indeed in 1971, when the UN voted to expel Taiwan and admit Red China, do you know what Reagan proposed? Leaving the UN. I don't think many people remember that, but that is what Ronald Reagan suggested, advised Richard Nixon. We should consider the UN a debating society, refuse to even vote in it, and walk away. Well, that has never happened. But here's James Freeman in today's Wall Street Journal, as China has gone through both some political and economic revolutions since 1971. Beginning in the 1970s, China pulled millions of people out of poverty by embracing elements of a market economy. Unfortunately, the lesson seems to be forgotten as the regime now increasingly relies on central planning. Reports of fraudulent, wasteful projects have marred Mr. Xi's campaign to eliminate rural poverty, a centerpiece of his China dream, particularly after 2015, when he ordered that officials sign pledges to meet poverty relief targets and be held accountable if things went wrong. The story illustrates that with or without Chinese characteristics, central planning doesn't work. As U.S. president in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan welcomed China's move toward a more open society and encouraged its leaders to continue expanding liberty. They didn't, violently suppressing calls for political freedom in Tiananmen Square just months after he left office, for example. 5 years earlier, in an address to students at Fudan University in Shanghai, President Reagan described a political system that was very different from the rule of the Beijing Politburo. He said, "Sometimes in America, some of our people may disagree with each other. We are often a highly disputatious nation. We rather like to argue. We are free to disagree among ourselves, and we do. But we always hold together as a society. We've held together for more than 200 years because we're united by certain things in which we all believe, things to which we've quietly pledged our deepest loyalties." I draw your special attention to what I'm about to say because it's so important to an understanding of my country. We believe in the dignity of each man, woman, and child. Our entire system is founded on an appreciation of the special genius of each individual and of his special right to make his own decisions and lead his own life. We believe, and we believe it so deeply that Americans know these words by heart. We believe that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Close quote. Joe Biden would call it the thing. I think in our engagement with China until now, we've forgotten some of this, as well as an elemental and foundational aspect of economic conservatism. That there cannot, in the long run, be economic liberty without political liberty. Many had been fooled into thinking there could be, particularly regarding China, or that economic liberty, or at least liberalization, would lead to political liberty. Fallacious. What happened instead was that economic liberty became a short burst and then receded. We should have learned this from our best economic teacher, Milton Friedman. It seems we did not. In his most important and landmark book, Capitalism and Freedom, written in 1962, Milton Friedman puts this right up front in the first chapter. I quote liberally. "It is widely believed that politics and economics are separate and largely unconnected. That individual freedom is a political problem and material welfare an economic problem, and that any kind of political arrangements can be combined with any kind of economic arrangements. The chief contemporary manifestation of this idea is the advocacy of democratic socialism by many who condemn out of hand the restrictions on individual freedom imposed by totalitarian socialism in Russia, and who are yet persuaded that it is possible for a country to adopt the essential features of Russian economic arrangements and yet to ensure individual freedom throughout the political arrangements. My thesis is that such a view is a delusion, that there is an intimate connection between economics and politics that only certain combinations of political and economic arrangements are possible, and that in particular a society which is socialist cannot also be democratic in the sense of guaranteeing individual freedom. Historical evidence speaks with a single voice on the relation between political freedom and a free market. I know of no example in time or place of a society that had been marked by a large measure of political freedom and that has not also used something comparable to a free market to organize the bulk of economic activity. History suggests only that capitalism is a necessary condition for political freedom. Clearly, it is, however, not a sufficient condition. The force of this abstract argument can perhaps best be demonstrated by a hypothetical example. One feature of a free society is surely the freedom of individuals to advocate and propagandize openly for a radical change in the structure of the society, so long as the advocacy is restricted to persuasion and does not include coercion. How could the freedom to advocate capitalism be preserved and protected in a socialist society? In order for men to advocate anything, they must in the first place be able to earn a living. This already raises a problem in a socialist society since all jobs are under the direct control of political authority. For advocacy of capitalism to mean anything, the proponents must be able to finance their cause, to hold public meetings, publish pamphlets, buy radio time, issue newspapers and magazines, or at least ads, and so on. How could they raise the funds? There might and probably would be men in the socialist society with large incomes, perhaps even large capital sums in the form of government bonds and the like, but these would of necessity be high public officials. It is possible to conceive of a minor socialist official retaining his job, although openly advocating capitalism. It strains credulity, however, to imagine the socialist top brass financing such subversive activities. Now you see the problem in China, right? Anyway, back to Friedman, if I may. Let us stretch our imagination and suppose that a socialist government is aware of this problem and is composed of people anxious to preserve freedom. Could it provide the funds? Perhaps. But it is difficult to see how it could establish a bureau for subsidizing subversive propaganda. But how could it choose whom to support? If it gave to all who asked, it would shortly find itself out of funds. For socialism cannot repeal the elementary economic law that a sufficiently high price will call forth a large supply. Make the advocacy of radical causes sufficiently remunerative, and the supply of advocates will be unlimited. But we are not yet through. In a free market society, it is enough to have the funds. The suppliers of paper are as willing to sell it to the daily worker as to the Wall Street Journal. In a socialist society, it would not be enough to have the funds. The hypothetical supporter of capitalism would have to persuade a government factory making paper to sell to him, the government printing press to print his pamphlets, a government post office to distribute them among the people, a government agency to rent him a hall in which to talk, and so on. Perhaps there is some way in which one could overcome these difficulties and preserve freedom in a socialist society. One cannot say it is utterly impossible. What is clear, however, is that there are very real difficulties in establishing institutions will effectively preserve the possibility of dissent. So far as I know, none of the people who have been in favor of socialism and also in favor of freedom have really faced up to this issue or made even a respectable start at developing the institutional arrangements that would permit freedom under socialism. Irving Kristol had similar views, writing, "It is simply not true, as one sometimes hears it said, that a market economy generates, as if by parthenogenesis, a system of political liberty, with the individual having rights both against government and in government. Still, it is clear that one can have a considerable degree of economic freedom with very little political liberty, at least for a while. But the converse is not true. Economic freedom may not be a sufficient condition for such liberty, but it is a necessary condition. Never in human history has one seen a society of political liberty that was not based on a free economic system, i.e. a system based on private property, where normal economic activity consisted of commercial transactions between consenting adults. Never, 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 no exceptions. Why is that? Well, to have a political regime, a liberal political regime without a system of economic freedom, one would need a very special kind of citizenry with a very special conception of liberty. These citizens would have to be special in two crucial respects. One, they would not regard economic growth, or to be more precise, the economic prosperity of the individual, as a very important good. For individuals do not prosper in economies where they possess no economic freedom. The state may prosper, it may become strong militarily, or be able to build wonderful cathedrals and pyramids, but only where individuals actually prefer such prosperity of the state to a prosperity of their own can political liberty exist without economic freedom. Two, they would have to share such a powerful consensus of beliefs and values that the political authorities would perfectly incarnate the collective will and would thus meet no resistance, but only approval in their operations, which would, of course, include the distribution of offices of wealth, of employment, etc. I'll bring this up to date for us. China liberalized for a while, economically. Then came Tiananmen. Then came more economic brutality that too many were willing to ignore. And then came more political oppression that too many yet were more willing to ignore. And now we end up where we are today, with a regime arguably more dangerous and combinatory than the Soviet Union ever was. Caution, I say arguably, even as more and more American corporatists, and certainly professional athletics, has no problem with any of this and has done the propagandist's job of sugarcoating, covering up, and appeasing. We had that in the 70s and 80s, too, with the Soviet Union. They just never had the economic strength, the economic liberty piece that allowed for their propaganda we now have with China, and the willing accomplices happy to take their prime cuts. There were no prime cuts out of the Soviet Union. As we study and relearn the roots of modern conservatism, let us not forget the economic lessons either.